again?
Islam Hakim.
Islam Hakim.
Previously I was called Tim.
You were?
Previously I was called Tim.
Gultim. What is that, German?
I was called Tim.
Tim. I said Gultim. Okay.
Called Tim, yeah.
Okay. So it'd be good to get this, because a lot of the things that you're saying are the exact points I'm trying to explain to atheists.
Yeah.
You came up to me randomly, and you said to me the exact thing that I've been telling these guys for many, many years, which is you cannot be an atheist in that sense. Randomness is not what you think it is. They deify a lot of these things. And what's interesting as well is when you were speaking, I realized there's a lot of teleological language being used.
There is.
However, when it comes to God, you cannot speak about that. But other things, you surely can. So, let's start with the beginning. Your entry into this area started off as an atheist.
Yes.
And what type of atheist would you say, like, definitely there's no God?
I was not just there's no God, but I believed, that religion was a tool to control the masses, that it was
Opiate of the masses.
Cause of problems in the world.
Were you a new atheist?
Sorry?
Were you a new atheist? Hitchens, Dawkins, these guys?
I used to think Hitchens was so intelligent. I really, but this was before I had therapy and understood what toxic malignant narcissism was, right? But, I used to be like, oh, wow, and how can people read Dawkins and still think there's a watchmaker? How crazy is this? And, I used to...
Hook, line and sinker, you accepted it.
I never fully had faith in any of those things. So there was always this, as long as I got an open mind, I'm superior. As long as, so I don't have faith in anything. Like I would always, you would have these, it's funny because I could never see the hypocrisy or the change in my position, but in some points of debate or discussions, I would be like, we know this is true, look at all the evidence.
Categorical.
Blah, 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 blah. And then, when cornered, it'd be like, maybe not. And for me, I just did not see the hypocrisy in that.
And were you evangelizing atheism, would you say?
Very much. This was part of the, I was in, when I was in school, I'd always be taking on, particularly Christians, mostly surrounded by Christians. I went to a church to England school before I went to secular school. I also had some Jewish friends to talk to them about this stuff as well. But I was vehemently anti-religious. Anyone who was, religious, I wanted to sort of save them, or at least get them out of the face of other people and stop them spreading the disease of this stuff.
And at that time, if I said to you, you're going to be in Speaker's Corner 20 years from now talking about God, you'd say, you're insane, right? It was unthinkable. Unthinkable that you're going to make a change.
I would have probably said I never say never.
Right.
But, I would have said that I strongly doubt you're ever going to come up with any kind of evidence or proof that's sufficient because of the very nature of the thing you're claiming. I would say you're claiming something metaphysical, and we have better methods of achieving, access to truth than that. So I was very convinced that I would never be presented such proof. But I always said,
Did you accept metaphysics though? Did you accept that there's things beyond science, assumptions about the world being real, assumptions about epistemology and these types of things?
Ironically, for me, those were all the gaps.
Gaps, okay.
Yeah, so the whole God of the gaps thing, that's projection. Because all those metaphysical things actually represented gaps. And so either we knew what it was, because we had some canonical orthodoxy, we had some institutions had agreed this was the right theory or whatever, or it was one of the gaps. And so you can analyze and entertain those things metaphysically if it helps you deal with things, or helps you, patch between two different areas. You can talk about consciousness as a metaphysical entity if you want, but ultimately underlying it there'd be some physical reality that we've maybe yet to have a proper authenticated canonical theory.
So were you a physicalist?
Yes, yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Okay. And did you believe that physicalism was a proposition or a conclusion? Did you believe that, okay, this is my faith, I'm a physicalist, it's a proposition which I cannot prove, or it is just simply true?
No, for me it was a combination of brute fact and something which had been proved.
A brute fact and?
For me it was a brute fact, but also something that could be proved. Because I didn't realise at the
Interesting.
time I guess my philosophical maturity wasn't quite there enough to realise that if you're claiming something's a brute fact, you shouldn't really be claiming it can be proved. But I was like, you could take either.
That's an interesting...
Because previously I was like, well look, you can either just obviously everything physical, and yeah, if you want to build this hierarchy of abstract things, you can, and if at some point you go beyond what you physically know, you go for it, but it was all mental gymnastics to me. It's just like, if you need to, go for it. So you could do that way, or I could say, well, look, we can prove it from first principles. Let's start with, empirical observations. Everything comes from, knowledge comes from through your eyes or ears.
So you believed in a form of scientism of some sort?
Yes, but also, a baby is born with just a ton of connections in its brain, and it just blurts out whatever, and then the connections very quickly die off, and it gives shape to its, brain and its ability to then make sense of the world. And so, what we term knowledge is really, recognition of structure and pattern and things like this. Yeah.
So, when you were in this particular position and you're coming to these realizations, like you said previously, that there's all these parameters which I thought were immovable and unquestionable, but actually they're just assumptions. So things about physics itself, things about reality itself. I think you referred to Bohr earlier.
That was Born, Max Born.
Max Born, yes.
Different from Bohr.
Yeah, and that barrier being in place, firstly you have to be aware of the barrier, and then challenging that barrier meant the door to metaphysics was far more open than you initially supposed. Would that be the right way of putting it?
Yeah, it was interesting because, the guy I was talking to, Kareem, mashallah, he had so much patience with me. I was attacking him for like 6 months straight, and there was this gradual realization, and, that really, if I'm fair, if you apply the same standards, then I was relying on metaphysical entities during my studies, because at the time I would sort of fell into this Platonic belief, for example, which is pretty much how you're taught to think of physics, really, that made equations metaphysical entities, or rather the things equations represent being metaphysical entities, or that nature. Because at some point, however you go back, this is because of this, because of this, because of this, either it goes around in circles, in which case you're in the world of circular logic, or it doesn't go around in circles and it at some point terminates, and that's where I realized, if I have multiple points of termination, then Occam's razor is against me.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
So would you say at that point you became a sort of foundationalist? Things have to go back to self-evident truths which cannot be proven.
I always had a problem with self-evident truths because of human limitations. So using that as a basis for things, I always had a problem with it.
Okay. So what was your foundation at that point that led you to believing in God? What was the springboard or the catalyst?
The springboard was really, it was realizing certain necessary aspects of atheist belief.
Certain necessary aspects of atheist belief, I mean faith-based aspects.
Well, as I discussed before, although you can ideologically paint these atheist belief systems and structures, and there were different ones, sort of flavors I tried. I used to be, like I said, when I approached Kareem, I was very much a hard atheist, and I became a soft atheist at some point because the hard atheist position became untenable. Sorry, what was the question?
What was the catalyst that took you from that hard naturalism, physicalism, to, okay, before we get to God, the door to God is open. Not God itself, but, okay, there's something maybe beyond physicalism.
It was really leveling the playing field, because the thing with privateers versus pirates,
No.
freedom fighters versus terrorists. So privateers were, British state-sponsored pirates.
Oh, I see.
And pirates were...
So it's a subjective label we give,
it's where you give them the label, and that sort of games the playing field to start with.
Sure.
And so I realised, really, if we spoke about things on a level playing field as being entities with certain properties and characteristics, then, my prejudged argument saying, it's a God, sort of fell away. And then I realised, well, I also have entities with various different characteristics, and, I could come up with some de jure reasons why, this is different from that, without realising it was part of European exceptionalism. But de facto, trying to establish my beliefs without having a de facto God, one or more, was untenable.
So would you
So
say...
that was really sort of the thing, and I realised at some point that...
Yeah, would you say in a way that you discovered teleology is inescapable? Some form of telos, some form of purpose, agency, some form of personality, right? Some form of non-physicalistic consciousness was there.
The only problem I have with adopting the word consciousness is its definition is willing, even today. We don't have a good agreed definition of consciousness. So I break it down into sort of what I regard to be more fundamental aspects. So, for example, something that it's able to purvey information, I would choose. So information is a well-defined thing. I can talk about information theory, or we can talk about information in physical systems. We can talk about the possessor or originator of power, and a thing that exerts will or intention. So we could talk about these aspects, but I wouldn't sort of bundle things up in consciousness. Like every like I said before, I'm autistic. Every single term has to be very, very well defined.
Okay, so let's start with non-reductive materialism. Was that would that capture your position?
Define non-reductive materialism as you see it.
That's a good question. So materialism, everything can be broken down to physical causes, effects, within time, space, and matter.
Yes.
You were? Okay, good.
I was previously, yeah.
Okay, so that position changing over to a new position. What was the new position?
There wasn't really a well-founded intermediate position between that and La ilaha illallah.
Allahu Akbar.
Because it was, as I sort of tried to find my new position, because I couldn't bear hypocrisy. But I was sure there'd be some other kind of way, and just trying to search for and find these positions, I realised that ultimately you wouldn't. And so I ended up being, okay, whatever the nature of this one God is, there is one of them.
Okay.
And it's so there's, I think, if memory serves, the order was there must be one such entity, and then there was that entity must be external to and encompassing the thing that it made. And then, then the things about knowledge and will came later after that. So it was kind of looking at the Isma wa Sifat.
Wow.
But I can't remember the exact order. I wish I could, but I'm pretty certain that. Okay, if there is something other than things that are built from physicality, there must be one of them. If there were more than one of them, that introduces its own system of contradictions. So it was, I'd say that was the first bit.
Yeah. So Allah says in the Quran, if there was more than one, the heavens and the earth they would be in disarray. So conceptually,
it was very interesting when I read that, because it's such a deep statement. And I have seen many videos where people sort of talk about this, and people go, yeah, I guess, like they would have a passion interest and whatever, but no, it's way more fundamental than that. I mean, you end up with axiomatic systems, effectively, that are incongruent with one another, and therefore you end up with this kind of, you would end up with a beyond chaotic system. It would be a system that's would never be able to
cohere,
settle, would never be able to cohere, but also would never really be able to come into what we could define as a cogent, consistent existence.
Yeah.
Because this is one of the things that was a very interesting realization as well, is that reality is all connected, it's all consistently connected. And it's funny how, like, when you learn about quantum theory, maybe a bit in A-levels, you think, okay, there's a you've got your protons and neutrons in the middle, and you've got electrons on the outside, and free space in between. 99% free space in an atom. And you learn that there's gravity, two separate masses, like free between them. And by the time you go through and you're in the third year and doing masters, or you're doing further research, and you look at the nature of quantum fields and what they really are, you have to have what's called, there's this topic called topology, which is the study of the structure and connectivity of things. And things have to be, topologically connected, and that's a fundamental requirement. Like, without that, you can't even build these equations, and you can't even, build physical theories and so on.
So, if I was to ask you, like, because you were an atheist, a militant atheist that became a Muslim, there's an argument I use, and I want you to check, you study theoretical physics, whether this is something that coheres. So when I have an atheist that come up to me and they say, don't worry about causality because quantum mechanics has challenged that, or randomness exists, I usually give an answer, and I want your honest thoughts on this. I could be right or wrong, but I want your thoughts. What I say to them is this: quantum mechanics currently cannot be used as an argument against causality or something else, because one, there isn't a consensus. We have the many worlds, we have the Copenhagen, we have the informational, relational, shut up and calculate. So to try and make an argument when there's no consensus, that itself doesn't make any sense. Secondly, the interpretations of those things have presumptions, and those presumptions are not laid out to the public. So to come up with these ideas like quantum mechanics challenges predestination, it's premature. That's the argument I make.
I mean, it is premature usually. I think one thing you've got to note is that quantum mechanics as properly defined is only defined mathematically. It only has a mathematical definition which is a correct representation of it. As soon as you start using cultural language, it's a misrepresentation. It's like
interesting.
If you take the names and attributes of Allah and you just translate them into the nearest English alternative, you don't get a correct representation. And this is why we see people straw manning it all the time, right? Yeah. And so it's a similar thing. You'll find these people who are saying, "Oh, quantum mechanics challenges causality." I bet most of them will just have read popular science articles, or they've watched some video or whatever and found it interesting, and they sort of pounced on this as being something. So to go back to what you're saying, like all these different interpretations of quantum mechanics basically don't make any difference to functional use of quantum mechanics, which is really an engineering tool.
Could I put it in other words?
Yeah,
what you're saying is, because quantum mechanics is only put in mathematical language, when you use another term and try and import that, you're going to lose what the data or the argument is. So for example, causality...
You lose what has actually been validated. So what has been validated is the mathematical model, not the interpretations.
Good.
Right? This is very,
good,
very
good,
important.
Good.
And yet people take the interpretations being somehow validated, or at least plausible, because they are in some way consistent with mathematics. But here's the trick. They're not. We're still looking for an interpretation that is consistent with the mathematics. There's always a problem. And that's sort of where we are. That's why we're in this position of big mystery.
And would you say, sometimes we're told science makes a lot of progress, but it seems in this domain of quantum mechanics, there hasn't been much progress in 100 years.
This is very interesting because there is a big difference between what's spoken about inside and outside of the institutions. And Sabine Hossenfelder is one of those physicists who's sort of breaking those silos a bit. But if I look at, for example, Sean Carroll, there's so many times when I've seen his public lectures and he says, we know this, we know that, and yet then he's got funding to work on papers to look at the very thing that's unknown that he said we know. Because, so there is a lot of, I don't think it's intentional dishonesty. There's this kind of system of saying, oh, well, when we're preaching to the masses, we're allowed to dumb down, simplify, whatever. It doesn't matter how wrong it is, as long as they feel they've got something.
Yeah. So what do you think about Sabine? What do you think about her claims that she makes about big science, misrepresentation, funding? She's made some very surprising claims, let's just put it that way.
I think she's very honest, and a lot of the claims that she said, they match up with what I suspected or have seen or have heard anyway, and I don't think they're that crazy. It's a lot more honest perspective of how science works. It's, at the end of the day, physics and the other sciences really, they are sociological phenomena. And that was a bitter pill to swallow, because I used to, without realising it, put my faith in it. Now, that doesn't make it fundamentally right or wrong, but you've got to realise that throughout the development of physical theories, if you take from Newton onwards, or you take from pre-Newton, it's always been a few competing theories. There's never as many theories as there are people's brains. You know, it's not like everyone gets their own theory. There's this flocking that goes on, and then there becomes like a duel between them, and then there's the winner. Like in thermodynamics, there was caloric theory versus other nature of temperature and what it meant, and so on. So there's the battle, and then one wins. And then there was quaternions versus Cartesian, and that was related to the constructive versus formalist wars I was talking about, and one of them wins. And then there's the views of electromagnetism, and then one of them wins. Is there an other? And
philosophers call this the underdetermination of theory by observation. As in, there's a huge problem that the same data can give rise to alternative theories which are completely inconsistent.
Well, and this is one of the interesting things, because the proof is usually, it only needs to be sufficient to defeat the other contenders.
Yes.
Right? But it's only which other contenders are permitted. You know? And that you can't have too many contenders. And it's not like... It's difficult to talk about this stuff properly because... Sorry, I have to walk closer because the... crazy lady. I shouldn't say that. But, it's difficult to talk about this without sounding like you're saying scientists are all involved in some big active
we have to be careful of that.
Because there is, I believe what's happening is more like an emergent collusion. So it's like an emergent phenomenon. It comes, if you take the sort of rules of the system, how it works, you get a bunch of people who have to vie for a certain amount of funding. There is a certain kind of structure, and therefore there's some kind of hierarchy. Some people have tenure. There's a limited amount of labs, resources, so on and so forth. Like all of these factors conspire, and also there was this dramatic shift in sort of, publishing and the expectation to push out papers, and how publish or perish, the importance of having papers.
And one paper having 15 authors.
Well, this too. But the other one is an interesting shift where people accept this idea of to be scientific it has to be falsifiable. It's like, yes, that's true, but it also, that doesn't take away the requirement of verifiability. You need both. So then you had a whole bunch of people associated with CERN, for example, that are just throwing out some theory, saying, it's just they're falsified. That's still valid science. And it's like, but it was never going to work. The maths never worked. You never even showed. I think a lot of people appear to start using experiments as an alternative to doing the maths, because the maths got too hard. Right? There's this whole. A lot of people don't realise You've got to look at the timing of things, right? You had Richard Feynman, who was credited with the path integral formulation of quantum mechanics, and this at the time was insane, because you have what's called a divergent infinite series, and you're summing it up. Now, if anybody other than Feynman had suggested that, they would have been laughed out of academia. If a student had suggested it, they'd be laughed out of the classroom, and told to go study, because summing a convergent series is like, it's just demonstrating you don't understand the basics. But he gets to just say it, people just flock and find a way to make it work. This is kind of fascinating, but in the course of doing that, they then use various different bits of data where they say, okay, I can find these statistical correlations and connections and so on and so forth, and I can make these fit. In the beginning, his maths wasn't even reproducible. He originally developed, calculated the fine structure constant, and then recalculated it, make it fit, and so on.
And I would say also that there's a lot of name dropping used. I mean, the argument from authority is not invalid. Like sometimes you can say, for example, I'll refer to Michael Bruce and I'll say Michael Bruce said this, right? But in the case where the arguments from authority, but the argument from that authority, the people don't even understand.
It's interesting. So I take the position, I used to take a very hard position that argument from authority is fundamentally wrong.
Yeah.
Now I take the position that argument from authority can, it can help you to spend your time more wisely.
Yeah.
Right? So that's good, but it can't affect you in matters of faith. I would not change.
Even in Islam we have this. We have schools of thought, Hanafi and Shafi'i.
But I would never believe something just because a scholar says so. But I also wouldn't waste my time going through like every random person's opinion and treat them as more important or interesting than Ibn Taymiyyah. But also just because it's come from Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't mean I accept it because he's not Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? But so it gets a bit complicated. Similarly with with physics, you have people like keeps popping up on my YouTube. There's this guy called Unzicker. This guy called Unzicker, I think it is.
Right.
He also has a lot of challenges to modern physics. But he also has no authority, no credibility. But I spent some time looking into him anyway. But he also doesn't seem to have any real comprehension of how physics works. So he doesn't have, so he has no authority, but he also has not credentials. But apart from the credentials, if you give him the time and space, you find out he's just straw manning things left, right, and centre, and doesn't really get it in the first place.
There's a lot.
So it depends what kind of basis of authority you're speaking of. Right? Authority through credentialism or through an institution versus, authority through lots of people follow them. Right? As Professor Dave explains on the.
I just debated him.
How he's allowed to call himself a professor when he just has a bachelor's degree, I have no idea. You see what I mean? But having 4 million followers makes people treat him as a sort of authority.
So just on that point, when I debated him a few days ago.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I did. It's on my YouTube channel. So I asked him about somatic hypermutation. He didn't know what that was. I asked him about genetic assimilation. He didn't know what that was.
He doesn't even understand emergence. He doesn't understand chaos.
I'll tell you something really funny, right?
Have you seen him against Dr. Jim Tour?
Yeah, I have, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a child. Jim's a proper,
chemist and.
He's really good.
Look, I'll tell you something really funny during the debate. I gave him the 4 distinctions of causality of Aristotle to explain. Dennis Noble refers to them because he's trying to explain that genes are not efficient causes, they're causes in terms of form or templates or databases. He just wouldn't get it, and I thought this is such a basic point. So, you're right, there's a lot of these pretenders online, and I'll take your number, I'll send you the debate as well for you to watch.
I mean, I don't want to talk about someone who's not present too much. I only mention them in terms of differentiating different types of authority.
Yeah.
And so that's really sort of where I was getting about. So,
and that's they're people.
For me, that you take the different supposed authorities in different ways or for different reasons. But still, for me, like the only genuine authority is Allah, whatever is dependent on what comes from Allah, and that's very important to me. And that's part of.
That's your ultimate.
That's part of the reason that Islam was so strong in the first place is because going back to what I said before is I can't remember if it was before the cameras aside or not, but it's essentially you cannot do any better than the single axiom system. And so that's what it comes down to. So as long as everything is rooted from that axiom, that's the source of the authority. Now, if someone comes along and says, "I'm telling you something," and it fits neatly in this tree on the law without contradicting anything else, it's like, okay, cool. I can take that on temporarily. Many people say it fits in more, it sits well in my heart, it works when I speak to other people and so on. Gradually it becomes more part of it. But everything in that tree is potentially sacrificial except the Shahada. This is the fundamental action.
You know what I love about what you said? It reminds me very clearly of that statement of the Quran in which Allah says, whose statement is truer than Allah? As in, you need one foundation, one base, one branch, one root, one center where you're like, okay, that's immovable, now let me build my worldview.
Yeah, what's really interesting about this is because I used to think, religious people use God as that, they use God as an alternative to thinking and understanding and so on. And so, for me, I thought they used it as an alternative to reason and so on. But then, actually, I used to have different kind of rationality was broken into different philosophical areas. Biology over here, maths over here, physics over here, and so on. And the fact that no one could glue them together in a consistent fashion, never mind. That's just how things are. One of the axioms that accepted. Knowledge is fundamentally in separable compartments. That was the construction of the Enlightenment. And so when you have the single axiom approach, everything was unified. There's no barrier to investigating those things, but quite the contrary. Now there was no issues in looking at how they were related. All of a sudden, I was actually quite able to mentally connect, chaos theory and emergence that we were studying in nonlinear dynamics with, information theory, with the concept of, where did the information come from in the universe, given the second order thermodynamics and so on. So yeah, that was a very important point. Was how the concept of God actually enabled better and deeper investigation of various scientific areas and their connectivity.
And it's not
rather than what I thought would be the opposite. I thought
and it's not just the hard sciences. It goes into the social sciences. It goes into human nature, human behavior, ethics, morals. You know, one of the things that atheists say is theists are using God of the gaps. So they're using gaps, and they're using gaps to try and show there must be a God, right? When we say God is not an explanation of the gaps, God is the explanation of reality itself.
You know what's interesting is I looked for this God of the gaps argument. The God of the gaps argument is in almost every case.
Sorry, say that again?
The God of the gaps argument is in almost every case projected from someone else onto believers. It's not actually a position most believers hold themselves. Very few, even Christians, very few people say, oh, well, there's all these gaps in knowledge, so I'm going to plug them with God. But no one says that in reality. That's not, and even if they say that, they've been taught to say that, and it's not actually how they came to faith. You know? But it's very important, and was very important to the Enlightenment story, to insist that people only believe in God because of the gaps. But the irony is that they were busy building their own new religion, and they were building it modelled on ancient Greek.
Would you say that new atheism?
Sorry, would you mind having a discussion? We're trying to have a civil discussion. I can't hear myself. Thank you.
So, would you say that new atheism became like a religion replacement for a lot of people? The way that they had these...
It was a secret religion. The way I would say it is you have from the French Revolution, right? You have this very important push against the amount of influence Catholicism had and so on. And there's branching out of all these different kind of Christianities. And then they went to try and, okay, we need to have this separation between church and state. But what they did was create this new church, which is so fused with the state that they became one entity. But all they did was deny that it's a church, in the same way as they denied they had lots of gods. Remember I said before, if you have, Kronos and Fortuna. Kronos was Roman god of time. The Greeks had a similar one, of Kronos of time and Fortuna of chance. If you take away the personification, it doesn't take away its essence as a deity. And so they're re-importing deities. They're having deities that are taught by institutions. The institutions have, the levels of research you have to go to, which is just like how Pythagoras had his school, right? Where initially you go in and for the first 3 years, you take a vow of silence and you're just talked at, and you're not allowed to contribute yourself, and you gradually rise up. And so they recreated the Pythagorean
with the four horsemen, with the structure,
So for me, looking back, now I can see that where they were saying, oh, this is not a religion, these are not gods, it's just a fiat declaration. But de facto and functionally, they are deities in the same way as they have, the only difference is, okay, you don't have a statue, actually, they end up making symbols.
They do.
And they end up, don't realise how many sacrifices they're making on Mars. One of my favourite
epistemic sacrifices.
One of my favourite examples is Adam Smith, right?
Oh yeah.
Adam Smith, the market, how
wealth
it
of nations,
self-balances.
How
division
of labour,
self-balances as if it's some. It's replete.
What did he call it? The hidden hand.
The invisible hand.
Invisible hand. Yeah.
I mean, if that's not a deity, what is, right? But if they just by fiat, oh no, that's not a deity, and oh no, my investment, my sacrifices for the market. The government comes out and says you've got to sacrifice this or that for the health of the economy. Oh no, but it's not a deity. Oh no. It's like, come on, guys. It's not dishonest because they're so misled. They genuinely believe they've transcended polytheism.
Yeah.
But actually, what happened is the religion was perfected, and then they went backwards. They went back to polytheism without realizing it.
Exactly. And I'll tell you something very interesting. J.B.S. Haldane, he said, teleology is to the biologist a mistress. He can't live without her, but he doesn't want to walk with her in public. And it's so interesting because today you have the likes of Dawkins and all these other biologists who would use teleological language. In River Out of Eden, he says, design, a purpose, agency, these types of things, they are very good working tools, right? It helps you. So design is a research heuristic, and I'm just paraphrasing what he's saying. It's something which is used. Now, Francis Crick, discoverer of obviously the structure of the DNA.
Attributed it.
Attributed to it. That's another Rosalind Franklin and all those. Yeah, exactly. A lot of people don't know that. However, he said something very interesting. When it came to life, and in his book, it's called Life Itself, he said, look, there's two possibilities, abiogenesis or panspermia, directed panspermia, which is life was seeded, designed by extraterrestrial beings. So he's allowing himself a designer as long as the designer is not God.
Oh, not necessarily design. It could have been, it came on an asteroid and was seeded
rocket,
in this way. And this is the interesting thing: is there's this language of design is a really difficult hang-up to get over. I could never get over that before. Like, I think it's a very, very hard barrier to cross, because remember, like, when you're not a monotheist, all of these, if you don't believe in God, none of this is going to make sense, and so you'll never really understand what they're saying by designing. And so, because in their head, just in my head, it was always you're thinking about some architect sitting there drawing up plans, and then poof, they get made into a thing and so on, and it's like, obviously that's projection from how you think. Like, if you think of any more than that, it doesn't make sense. And so if you are a monotheist, then the language of design makes perfect sense. If you are not a monotheist, let's leave aside the fact that you're going to end up being polytheist. If you think you're an atheist, it's still useful to use the language of design, right? And now what's interesting is that progresses for a few hundred years, and it's like boiling a frog. I don't realise they've gone so far that they can't actually take out all that language anymore. It's gone too far, and if they were to go back and try, there's no starting point that doesn't have agency, that you try and shift the goalpost over here or over there, but ultimately I think the illusion only still runs because people have accepted knowledge being a priori separated in different categories, and they have their different specialists with their different specialised languages, and that's what sort of keeps the smoke and mirrors in place. But so while I believe that Allah obviously designed things with a purpose, of course, I think that makes perfect sense. I understand very well the position where you say, well, okay, order can emerge from chaos. We've seen this. We can show it in a lab, even do experiments on it. But it's not quite genuine. It's not quite true, because it's not pure chaos. There is chaos theory really talks about nonlinear dynamics and the ability to predict things with our current mathematical tools, which are mostly based on linear systems.
So I'd also push it back a bit further to what we were saying earlier. When they say we started off with the two gods that they have, which is time and randomness.
Just two of many.
Yeah, two of many, right?
That's just my favourite obvious example.
If ontological randomness does not exist, and it's only epistemic randomness that we're talking about, even this argument that chaos can generate order makes no sense anymore, because everything's determined.
Yes, it does, correct.
So often...
You will struggle to find many people who will accept that so easily. It's a very delicate... I had to stop and think for a moment through the stuff. That's going to be a very difficult sell to someone who doesn't, doesn't see your worldview. You don't have to necessarily take it, but they have to be able to see your worldview. Okay. But it is, I would agree. I think it's strong, it's just difficult to get across.
Good. So I think I definitely want to bring you for an interview. We'll do an interview, inshallah. We'll do an interview. We'll have, in fact, it'll be nice to break down your story into segments, because we kind of went in many different directions. But the last thing I just want to put to you is, Thomas Kuhn, he argues about paradigms and paradigms being incompatible.
Yes.
Meaning, for example, Newtonian mechanics and the Einsteinian worldview, time, space, even have different definitions. Even mass has a different definition. And what he's saying is, to switch between one to another is not just observation and evidence and experimentation. There is a conceptual shift you have to make from one to another, what he calls a gestalt shift. You know, the images which change.
Yeah.
Would you say your shift from materialism, atheism, physicalism to Islam, obviously there was an input of you studying theoretical physics and doing all this stuff, but there was an element of a choice that I am no longer going to live in a world of inconsistency. I want to be consistent with one deity rather than many.
Oh no, so I never wanted to live in a world of inconsistency. I never wanted to be a hypocrite. I just didn't realise how much I was an inconsistent hypocrite.
Right.
That's important. And I don't think there exists any atheist except that they are an inconsistent hypocrite. In the nicest possible way to any atheist out there, it's not your fault, you're very misled, you know. But
you've upset them.
You see what I mean? It's not that I suddenly went, oh, you know, I want God and to reject those things. I always wanted to reject, you know, things. So if you take your example of Newtonian mechanics and, you know, Einsteinian general relativity, Poincaré's relativity, I could say, that's another story. It's not really right to say Newton's wrong anymore. You know, it's correct within its domain of validity, and the concept of domain of validity is really, really important to understand. So, insofar as you're working in the Gestalt or the Newtonian framework, then it works. If you then are considering some system which is outside of that framework, or which extends beyond the bounds of validity of that framework, then you need another framework. And then, you know, general relativity itself starts to break down at certain points, and you move out of that framework.
Would you say
when I shifted, I would say into you know, monotheism, it's not that quantum theory became any more right and wrong. My understanding of its domain of validity shifted slightly, because for me it was no longer a foundational basis on which I could make arguments about the nature and existence of things. So its ontological status changed, but its nature, the mathematics of it, and the evidences for it didn't change at all. You know?
Yeah. Or another way of putting it is levels of abstraction. So when it comes to the big level, general relativity, Newtonian mechanics works. When it comes to a smaller level, that level of abstraction, it won't work.
Right, so this goes back to what I said about knowledge being separated in different compartments. You know, as an atheist, I had, you know, a little cave over here, and I jumped to another cave over there, and I'm in this cave, I'm being consistent. I'm in this cave, I'm being consistent. And the fact that I'm inconsistent between the two, it never even appeared, never made sense. But it's almost because my brain wasn't even able to think at a high enough level of abstraction to really connect those things. And it was only really when I had, you know, this top-down monotheism that I was then able to see them more and more.
Yeah, that's the point.
And
Top-down,
all the other abstraction layers then fit somewhere between, you know, Allah and everything else. Whereas previously, all the different abstraction layers are their own separate parcels, and you specialize, and you've got a lot of faith in other specialists. Even, you know, when you're studying quantum mechanics, let's say, you have to understand complex analysis. You just can't do it without complex analysis. No, complex analysis, it relies on Cauchy sequences and things like that, and you might learn what those
constraint conditions.
There's always at some point your professor goes, you have to just trust that's been done by those people. And I spent 15 years or more since I graduated buying up books from 1750 up to present day, following all those rabbit holes because I'm an autistic geek on this stuff. And it is really, really fascinating to see that the amount of faith that is actually required and that is baked in, but in a very sort of hidden way.
Absolutely. But I love what you said, that top-down theology, or we could say the epistemic doors being wide open because of La ilaha illallah. It makes everything make sense.
It was honestly, this was probably the most incredible thing, was as soon as this concept of what a deity actually was clicked, right? As soon as I realised I can screw a Manning deity this whole time, and if I take the actual concept that it is, then I'm a polytheist and a hypocrite. Okay, let's talk about this more seriously. There must be some way to sort this out, and so on and so forth. Ended up with the sort of logical acceptance that La ilaha illallah, to which I was very frustrated at the time. You can do, I think we're just finishing. But, you know,
he deserves a coffee after this, so we're going to go.
Okay. I was actually quite frustrated to find out having two crude had very different plans for university than becoming a pious person, and it was something I had to emotionally wrestle with. I very much didn't want it. But
it's a beautiful journey, though.
retrospect, it certainly was. But at the time, it was quite terrifying and frustrating. And then, but the one thing that sort of, I think the first benefit, I could say, was all of a sudden the ability to think top down, the ability to see things in their place relative to each other, to break down the artificial boundaries between knowledge that have been put in place from the rationalists through the Enlightenment period and so on. Like all of that baggage blowing away, I didn't lose any of the maths. Quite opposite. I now saw how it connected together more. I could better understand the relationship between constructivism and formalism. I could better understand, how and why Maxwell really was doing what he was doing, and the way he did a beautiful synthesis of thermodynamics with classical mechanics as it had been discovered, as it had been understood through what's called Lagrangians and so on. And he was absolutely stunning thesis, which previously I didn't really understand the depth of it. But looking back, when I had this top-down structure, then I could really see the depth. Because one of the things really interesting is three of the real main characters that actually gave us the foundations upon which modern physics was built was Maxwell, Hamilton, and Peter Guthrie Tate. These three absolute giants, and they were all dedicated believers in God.
Interesting, I didn't know that.
And they worked like three amigos, and Tate was also a theologian, and between them they basically had the whole rest of the world of physics and mathematics, against them. And they really established, Hamilton established the idea of non-commutative algebra and all this sort of stuff. And basically, most of the ideas from Hamilton's thesis and Copernicus got lifted and taken by the likes of Sophus Lie and so on to build this, really the German school under Hilbert. And it was mostly stolen valor, the way the whole thing it's all fascinating. I'm going to go up too much into the weeds, unfortunately, but basically it was Hamilton, and also Hamilton's principle, Hamiltonian mechanics, is fundamental to how we construct quantum mechanics now, particularly field theory, and Maxwell really established field theories writ large, and that's a whole other sort of detailed story.
So that's a part of history we don't know.
Really, the reason we don't learn them is to go back to what I said before about flocking and things like this. Like geopolitics has had such an important role in how physics developed, but it's not taught. I mean, the fact that the Germans regarded themselves as the men of electricity, they were like, the guys. And so for Maxwell to have come out with this title, well, we can't have that. And so there was always, as long as they could then squish things into their framework, it would be, okay. You have. I think it's probably too much detail to go into. Maybe we could go into an hour.
No, we should definitely. But I think one way of definitely putting it is the Quranic verse that whoever Allah gives light, they walk in Allah's light. I'm paraphrasing. When you have the light of theology, everything makes sense, from quantum mechanics to societies.
Right. I think this was the key thing I wanted to get across, if nothing else, was that I previously thought it was a barrier to or alternative to rational inquiry in discourse.
When it's the fountain.
Exactly the opposite.
Let's go before...
enabled it in an incredible way.
Absolutely. Let's go get some coffee and before we get disrupted again.